They called him Lilo, but behind that soft nickname was one of the most feared and cold-blooded gangsters in the history of New York. Carmine Galante wasn't just a mob boss. He was the man who turned the Mafia into a billion-dollar heroin empire. From the dark alleys of East Harlem to secret deals with the Sicilian Mafia, Galante built his fortune on drugs, violence, and betrayal. He didn't just rule the streets, he ruled through fear. Every rival, every informant, every man who stood in his way ended up either buried or broken. The Mafia Commission tried to stop him, but Galante was unstoppable, arrogant, brutal, and hungry for absolute power. Yet, in the world of organized crime, no king reigns forever. This is the story of how one man's greed for control turned him from the ruler of New York to the victim of his own empire. Carmine Galante, the heroin king, who ruled New York's Mafia empire. Carmine Galante's story begins in the gritty streets of East Harlem, New York, where survival meant power and fear meant respect. Born on February 21, 1910, to Sicilian immigrants Vincenzo and Vincenza Galante, Carmine was destined for the underworld long before he even understood what it meant. His father worked as a fisherman, but young Carmine wanted more than an honest living. He wanted control. From an early age, he showed a violent streak that terrified neighbors and fascinated older gangsters. Teachers described him as uncontrollable, his fists always his first answer to any problem. By age 10, he was running errands for neighborhood thugs. By 15, he was stealing cars and assaulting anyone who crossed him. The streets weren't his home. They were his kingdom in training. When Prohibition hit in the 1920s, opportunity came knocking. Bootlegging transformed New York's criminal world, and Galante was quick to seize it. He joined local street gangs that worked under the protection of the powerful Morello crime family, one of the earliest mafia organizations in America. His natural brutality made him stand out, and soon his name began circulating in police files. Arrested for assault and robbery multiple times before turning 20, Galante spent his teenage years in and out of juvenile reformatories. But every stint behind bars only hardened him. He came out tougher, colder, and more ambitious. He wasn't just another street punk. He was a soldier in the making. By the 1930s, the Mafia in New York was evolving. The old guard was being replaced by a new generation of organized, ruthless men who followed Lucky Luciano's commission system, uniting different families under shared rules and profits. Galante's violent reputation caught the attention of Joseph Bonanno, a rising boss who needed muscle to protect his growing interests. Bonanno saw potential in Galante, a man who didn't ask questions, didn't show mercy, and didn't fear death. Galante became one of Bonanno's most trusted enforcers, earning the nickname Lilo, which in Sicilian slang meant little cigar, a reference to his constant habit of chewing cigars even in the middle of violent confrontations. Working for the Bonannos gave Galante structure and power. He began managing protection rackets, gambling operations, and bootlegging routes across the city. But what set him apart was his willingness to personally carry out assassinations. Law enforcement believed Galante played a role in several high-profile hits during the 1930s, including the infamous murder of journalist Carlo Tresca, who criticized Mussolini and the Mafia's Italian connections. Though he was suspected, Galante was never convicted, a sign of how deeply protected he was within the Mafia hierarchy. His loyalty, silence, and efficiency made him invaluable. Yet Galante wasn't just muscle. He was intelligent and calculating. He understood that true power didn't come from doing hits. It came from controlling money. By the 1940s, he had expanded into narcotics smuggling, making connections with Sicilian traffickers who saw America as a gold mine for heroin distribution. This move would change the Mafia forever. Galante became the bridge between the old Sicilian families and the American mob, a position that gave him influence far beyond his rank. During this period, he also served time in prison for federal offenses, but even behind bars, Galante's reputation grew. Fellow inmates and guards alike knew that messing with him meant death. When he was released, he returned to the streets more dangerous than ever. The combination of prison toughness, mafia loyalty, and his growing vision for a narcotics empire set him apart from his peers. By the end of the 1940s, Carmine Galante was no longer just a soldier. He was an emerging power player in the Bonanno family. He had the trust of bosses, the loyalty of soldiers, and the fear of rivals. The streets whispered his name with both respect and terror. What began as a poor immigrant son in Harlem was evolving into something far more menacing. The man who would one day be called the Heroin King of New York. After World War II, Carmine Galante returned to New York with a new purpose: money, power, and total control over the drug trade. The war had changed everything. Soldiers came home, the city was booming, and addiction was quietly spreading through the streets. Galante saw what others didn't. Heroin would become the mafia's new goldmine. While other bosses still relied on gambling and loan sharking, Galante began building an international narcotics network that would make him one of the most powerful drug lords in the world, the richest and most feared men in organized crime. His genius was in his connections. Galante turned to his Sicilian roots, reaching across the Atlantic to make deals with powerful mafia clans in Palermo and Castellammare del Golfo. Together, they created a system that funneled heroin from the poppy fields of Turkey to the labs of Sicily, and finally to the streets of New York. It was a perfect operation, invisible, profitable, and protected by fear. Galante's contacts in Montreal helped him move shipments across the Canadian border, using bakeries, grocery stores, and especially small pizzerias as front businesses. That network would later become infamous as the Pizza Connection, a billion-dollar drug pipeline. Galante ruled this empire with cold precision. He never touched the drugs himself. Instead, he made sure his soldiers and Sicilian partners handled distribution, keeping his own hands clean. Every ounce that hit New York brought in thousands of dollars, and Galante demanded a cut from every transaction. Those who refused or underpaid disappeared. His word was law. Even the Bonanno family's top men feared crossing him. While Joseph Bonanno respected Galante's success, he also realized the danger. Galante's ambitions were growing faster than anyone could control. By the mid-1950s, the money was staggering. Millions of dollars flowed weekly through Galante's hands. He bought luxury cars, houses, and influence inside the mafia hierarchy. But with power came arrogance. Galante began acting as if he were above the commission itself, ignoring the traditional rules that governed the mafia. He didn't ask permission to expand territories, and he didn't share profits with rival families. To him, the heroin trade was his creation, and no one else deserved a share. That defiance made him enemies everywhere. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, began closing in. They couldn't catch him with drugs, but they tracked the patterns: Sicilian immigrants arriving, unexplained cash transactions, and murders following every disruption in his network. Still, Galante moved like a ghost, always one step ahead. When pressure built too high, he vanished into Canada or Puerto Rico until the heat cooled down. The authorities knew he was the mastermind, but they could never prove it. By the early 1960s, Galante's empire was unstoppable. His control over the heroin trade stretched beyond New York, to Chicago, Montreal, and even into South America. He had built a shadow empire worth hundreds of millions, with loyalty bought through money and fear. Even within the Bonanno family, some whispered that Galante was more powerful than the boss himself. His ruthless methods earned him the nickname the Heroin King of New York. But to those who worked under him, He was simply death in a suit. Every deal, every killing, every shipment strengthened his grip on the streets. But it also drew the attention of rival families who saw his success as a threat. The Gambinos, the Lucchese's, and even some inside the Bonanno ranks began to plot quietly. Galante had achieved the impossible, total control of New York's drug trade. But his hunger for power blinded him to a truth every mobster eventually learns. In the Mafia, no one rules forever. By the late 1960s, Carmine Galante had become more than just a powerful figure in the Bonanno family. He was a problem for everyone in the Mafia. His hunger for domination had turned allies into enemies, and business partners into targets. Galante no longer saw himself as part of an organization. He saw himself as the organization. The heroin empire he built was vast and unstoppable, but his ego grew just as fast. He didn't just want profits. He wanted respect, fear, and recognition as the supreme power in New York. To Galante, the Mafia Commission, the council created by Lucky Luciano to maintain peace between families, was a cage, not protection. He refused to bow to it, setting himself on a collision course with every major boss in the city. While the Bonanno family had been one of the most respected groups in the Mafia during the 1950s, its influence began to decline after internal conflicts and federal investigations. Joseph Bonanno's failed attempt to seize control of the entire commission, the so-called Banana War, left the family fractured and weakened. But for Galante, this chaos was an opportunity. He returned from a prison sentence in 1974 with one goal: to take back what he believed was rightfully his. As soon as he was released, Galante started moving aggressively to rebuild the Bonanno Empire, under his rule alone. He installed loyal Sicilian soldiers, known as Zips, into key positions within his crew. These men were fresh from Italy, ruthless, and completely devoted to Galante. The other New York families viewed them with suspicion, especially since the Sicilian connection controlled much of the heroin supply. Galante's decision to bring them in only deepened the rift between him and the rest of the commission. He didn't care. With the Zips by his side, he believed he could eliminate anyone who opposed him. Under his leadership, violence once again consumed the streets. Murders of rival drug dealers and suspected informants became routine. Galante's message was clear: New York's heroin business belonged to him alone. He openly defied the Mafia Commission, refusing to share profits or territory. When other bosses questioned him, he mocked them. "Who's going to stop me?" he reportedly bragged. "I'll kill them all." That arrogance turned his name into a curse in Mafia circles. Behind closed doors, powerful figures like Paul Castellano of the Gambino family and Tony Salerno of the Genovese family began discussing what to do about Galante. Even inside the Bonanno family, resentment grew. Some saw him as a tyrant who would bring down the entire organization with his recklessness. Others were simply terrified of him. Galante's paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, not even his closest associates. He surrounded himself with bodyguards and kept a tight circle, but even within that circle, betrayal was quietly brewing. The FBI, meanwhile, intensified its surveillance. Agents followed his every move, trying to map the full extent of his heroin network. But Galante was careful, using coded conversations and trusted couriers. His confidence bordered on invincibility. He believed no one would dare touch him, not the law, not the commission, not even his own family. But in reality, his defiance had made him the most wanted man in both the legal and criminal worlds. By 1978, the Mafia Commission had had enough. The other families agreed that Galante's greed was too dangerous. He wasn't just disrupting business. He was threatening the balance of power that kept the Mafia alive. In the shadows, a deadly plan began to form, one that would end his reign for good. Galante, however, remained oblivious. He smoked his cigars, dined with his Zips, and continued to boast about his empire. What he didn't realize was that the men who smiled beside him were already planning his execution. On July 12th, 1979, the summer sun burned hot over Brooklyn, and Carmine Galante felt untouchable. For months he had ignored the warnings, brushed off the whispers, and mocked the commission that had quietly turned against him. He was still convinced no one had the courage to challenge him. That day, he arrived at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick, a small, quiet place owned by a Bonanno associate. Galante came with two of his most trusted Sicilian bodyguards, Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato. The plan was simple: a private lunch, cigars, and talk about business. To Galante, it was just another afternoon of power. To his enemies, it was the perfect setup. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was calm. Galante ordered his favorite dish, fish and salad, and as usual, smoked his cigar throughout the meal. He laughed, he boasted, and he spoke about expanding his heroin operations even further. But outside, a car slowly rolled to a stop near the front. 3 masked gunmen stepped out, each armed with shotguns and pistols. They had been sent to carry out a message, not just to kill Galante, but to prove that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the commission's authority. At 2:45 p.m., gunfire shattered the quiet afternoon. The assassins burst through the back gate into the restaurant's garden patio where Galante was seated. The attack was swift and brutal. Bullets tore through the air, hitting Galante in the chest and face before he even had time to react. He was thrown backward, collapsing onto the ground, his cigar still clutched between his teeth. In seconds, the heroin king of New York was dead. The bodyguards who had sworn loyalty to him, Bonventre and Amato, didn't lift a finger. Instead, they calmly walked away, untouched, their betrayal as cold as the execution itself. When the police arrived, the scene was haunting. Galante's body lay sprawled on the patio, surrounded by broken plates, spilled wine, and the smell of gunpowder. His cigar, still resting in his mouth, became the most iconic image in Mafia history, a symbol of arrogance and downfall. The hit was perfectly timed, perfectly executed, and approved by the very bosses Galante thought he could defy. The commission had spoken. The man who had declared himself untouchable had been silenced by the same organization he once helped build. News of Galante's murder spread like wildfire across New York. The Mafia world was stunned, but not surprised. For years he had pushed too far, killed too many, and refused to share power. His death sent a clear message to every mobster who dreamed of breaking the rules. No one could stand above the commission. FBI agents and journalists flooded the scene, photographing the patio where one of the most feared men in Mafia history met his end. The photograph of Galante's lifeless body, cigar still between his teeth, became front-page news across the country. In the aftermath, the Bonanno family fell into chaos. Without Galante's brutal leadership, factions within the family began fighting for control. Some of his loyal Sicilian soldiers fled back to Italy, fearing revenge from rival families. Others were hunted down and executed. The heroin network he had built began to crumble as law enforcement and rival mobsters moved in to claim what was left. Galante's murder was not just a killing. It was an execution ordered by the very system he had refused to respect. The commission had reasserted its dominance, reminding every Don that power came with limits. For Galante, that lesson came too late. The man who once believed he ruled New York died surrounded by the very men who betrayed him, in the same city where he built his empire from blood, fear, and heroin. Even in death, Carmine Galante's shadow loomed large over New York's underworld. The image of his lifeless body, cigar still clenched between his teeth, became a grim symbol of both arrogance and inevitability in the Mafia world. For years, he had believed himself invincible, a king who ruled the streets through fear and profit. But his assassination in 1979 didn't just end a man's life. It ended an era. His death sent shockwaves through every crime family, reshaping the future of organized crime in America and changing how the mafia viewed power forever. In the days following his murder, investigators, reporters, and mob insiders all asked the same question. Who exactly gave the order? Everyone suspected the commission, and they were right. The hit had been approved by the leaders of the Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families. Even members of his own Bonanno family had secretly supported it. They all agreed that Galante had become too reckless, too greedy, and too dangerous to live. By eliminating him, they restored balance to the mafia, at least temporarily. But while the commission may have ended his reign, Galante's influence didn't die that day. The heroin empire he built continued to operate for years after his death, managed by the same Sicilian connections he had once trusted. The pizza connection network he helped create expanded into Europe and Canada, smuggling billions of dollars worth of heroin into the United States. Law enforcement eventually cracked down on the operation in the 1980s, leading to one of the largest drug trials in U.S. history. But the roots of that network, the methods, the structure, the ruthlessness, all traced back to Galante's blueprint. Even his enemies admitted that no one understood the business of narcotics like he did. Inside the Bonanno family, Galante's fall left a dangerous power vacuum. Factions formed, each claiming the right to lead. Some sought to restore stability, while others wanted to continue Galante's drug empire. The internal wars that followed weakened the family for decades. By the mid-1980s, the Bonannos had lost much of their influence, becoming the smallest and most fractured of New York's 5 families. Many of Galante's loyal men were murdered or imprisoned, and those who survived learned the same lesson he never did. Power in the mafia always comes with a price. For law enforcement, Galante's death was both a victory and a warning. His violent end proved that even the most feared men could fall, but it also revealed how deeply entrenched the heroin trade had become in American life. The FBI and DEA intensified their war on organized crime, tracing Galante's smuggling routes, seizing shipments, and arresting hundreds of his associates. Yet despite their success, the drug trade continued, because Galante had built a machine too vast to destroy overnight. He had transformed the mafia from a local criminal organization into a global narcotics empire, and that transformation changed everything about organized crime in the 20th century. Among mob historians and former associates, opinions about Galante remain divided. Some call him a visionary, a man who saw where the real money was before anyone else. Others see him as the perfect example of mafia self-destruction, a man consumed by greed, blinded by ego, and undone by his own brutality. In truth, he was both. Galante had the intelligence of a businessman, the cunning of a strategist, and the heart of a killer. That combination made him unstoppable, until it made him dead. Today, decades after his death, Carmine Galante's story stands as one of the most powerful reminders in mafia history. No matter how strong you are, no matter how feared or respected, there's always someone waiting to pull the trigger. Galante believed he could rule New York forever. Instead, his empire of heroin and blood ended in a quiet Brooklyn garden, with smoke still rising from his final cigar, a fitting end for the man the world will always remember as the heroin king of New York.